Hello. I wanted to discuss with you what abuse in children is. It is intentional harm caused to the child. Children will get hurt as they grow up. Climb a tree, they fall off the tree, they get a broken bone, or they fall down and they fall forward and they get bruises. So children getting hurt is just part of growing up. But when a caregiver intends to cause harm, that is when it's going to be considered abuse to children. And the different types of abuse include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. We don't want to forget neglect. And let's focus on neglect at this moment. There is a physical type of neglect when the child is not bathed, the child doesn't have proper clothing, and the letter of the law reads that if you physically neglect a child, then that's child abuse. But we fall into the gray area. When is that considered abusive? If a child goes a whole week, have you abused a child? But if we continue to focus that there's intentional harm meant to that child, I think that'll help us understand. It's one thing if you don't have the money to buy the latest coat for your kid. It's another one to not provide a jacket altogether for the child, okay? Another type of neglect that some people don't actually think of is educational neglect. And educational neglect would be keeping them out of school, and I believe typically it depends on the state, but if you keep the child out of school more than 8 to 10 days, unexcused absence, that gives them reason to come in and look. When I say they, would be CPS, Child Protective Services. They have the right to actually come into your home at any time and remove the child. But their number one goal is to keep the child with the caregiver. So it's not something they would look forward to doing or would choose to do that. But educational neglect would be not having them enrolled. You can homeschool your child. You just have to let the system know that that's what you're doing. And the main thing is to have them in school. Legally, a child has to be in school at the age of 7, and they can drop out at 16. I don't know if that's something we want to go advertise to kids, but they don't have to be in preschool. They don't have to be in kindergarten. They do need to start something by the time they're 7, so for first grade. But educational neglect is certainly a type of neglect. Medical neglect is another form. And this is not giving medical care to the child as needed. Let's say the child has been laid in the crib and given sugary drinks, and they're when they go to bed and their teeth start rotting out and they're not taken to the dentist. That's actually considered medical neglect. That would be reason enough to have the child removed from the home. If the child, oh goodness, God forbid, but this is actually a true story I heard from a law enforcement agent. The child fell from the tree and he broke his arm, and instead of going to the hospital, the dad actually got a splint, if you will, 2 boards above and below the broken arm and wrapped it around. He went through the whole night this way, went to school the next day, and that's when they called, and he was removed from the home. So medical neglect, not taking your child to the doctor when he's sick, as well as neglecting even dental care. That would be considered neglect. Okay, that's medical. Nutritional is yet another type. And this is not giving your child the right kinds of food. You know, I mean, sometimes we're guilty and they get Cheetos and Dr. Pepper one night for supper, but if it's chronic, it happens over and over where they are not given the nutrition that they need. That is nutritional neglect. Also depriving them of food and not giving them adequate amounts of calories that they need to grow and flourish. So that is important to keep in mind. Inadequate supervision is another type. Basically, if the child's left alone, inadequate supervision can be anything from walking away from an 18-month-old if he's on a counter and just saying, I want you to stay there. Well, obviously, an 18-month-old is not going to do that, so that would be inadequate supervision. You know, it's illegal to leave your kid at home by himself. And I know parents work, and it happens. There's 8-year-olds that go home to an empty house. That's called latchkey children. That is actually against the law, and your child could be removed for that reason. But it happens so much that likely it wouldn't happen. It's really not in the child's best interest, in finding after-school care. It would be much better. But the point being, I believe at the age of 12, You might could leave the child at home for 2 hours, so you could go to the movies or something like that. It's a little gray there, but there's definite laws that says that you cannot, it would be inadequate supervision if you leave the child for very long. And we certainly could agree that a 5-year-old in charge of a toddler would be hugely inappropriate and a form of neglect, and just leaving the child altogether left alone. And that would actually go under abandonment, which is another type. Just leaving the child altogether. And then they're going to include emotional abuse. And I don't want to be confusing on this. Okay, there's emotional abuse is considered a type of neglect. The reason they do that is because by law there is no definition of emotional abuse. But interestingly, it underlies all of the type of abuse. If a child's been physically abused, he's been emotionally abused. If there's neglect, there's emotional abuse. So there's no way around it. And the sad thing about emotional abuse is it's just as painful as any other type of abuse, but it doesn't leave a mark. You don't have a bruise to say, ow, okay, this is why I hurt. But rather, they have to just feel crummy and not be sure why. And that would also go in with verbal abuse, being told how you're no good and how you can't measure up. Why can't you be more like so-and-so? And that could also fall under a type of emotional abuse. But it does exist. It is huge. I don't know. Go to Walmart on any weekend night, 11 o'clock at night, and you hear all kinds of verbal attacks to kids. Everybody's tired, and sometimes things are said. But just keep in mind, no caregiver is going to be perfect. We're going to say things at times that we later wish we hadn't because it's hurtful. Keep in mind, though, the abuser is the one who does intentional harm. They're wanting the child to feel worse. They're wanting to bring the child down. So that's where it becomes an actual abusive situation. So that is neglect. And let me go over one more time. There's physical neglect, educational, medical, nutritional, inadequate supervision, abandonment, and emotional. Thanks for listening. Go not neglect a child.